Hi, my name is Joe Park, CEO of Horizon Stewardship. Welcome to the question and answer portion of the webinar, 7 Shifts That Will Define a New Normal for Local Church Ministry. This question and answer session was cut away from a webinar that we did, and you can download that webinar at giving365.com. That's Horizon's online resource library, giving365.com. This is a Q&A portion. I hope you enjoy. How do we develop leaders to engage in this new environment? Too many of our leaders seem stuck in wishing to return to what we had. That is a great question.
That is a great question. And so it just might be helpful to remember that change is not easy, even healthy change that's going to help us. So as an example, because I'm over 50, I get to go visit my doctor every year. Fortunately, I got that visit in before the pandemic hit this year. And every year he takes a look at my vital signs and he suggests changes that I could be making in my lifestyle, my eating patterns, my exercise, just my sleep patterns, things like that. And I don't naturally want to exercise. I don't naturally want to eat well. I don't naturally want to sleep well. There's too much life to live to get all of that right. But he begins to cast a vision for, if I continue to live my life like I'm living it now, I'm not going to be able to live as long, and I'm not going to be able to experience the full life. And so it begins with a vision casting that needs to happen. This is why the pain of staying where we are is much worse than the pain of the change that we need to go through to get to a better place. So all that to say, it really begins with a vision cast, I think. Why do we exist as a church? Where is God calling us in the future? And really the hard conversation about then why do we have to make the changes that are required to get to that next place? And as leaders, you have to lead other leaders. You have to be the voice that casts that vision and helps people see why we can't stay where we are. We actually have to cross the river into the promised land.
So Samuel's asking a question. 70% of our members are over 70 years old, and they're not wanting to be digital. How can we encourage them in this regard?
Well, I don't know, is the honest truth. I don't know if you're going to be able to make that shift at this point. The only way I have found that churches that have a high concentration of older folks in their congregation, the only way that I've seen them actually make the shift is when they cast the vision again for reaching their kids and their grandkids. And when you can effectively cast that vision, I have found that people my age and older are willing to sacrifice a little bit if it means that the church is actually going to be able to connect with my kids now and eventually my grandkids in the future. But just to be honest, Samuel, not every church is going to be able to make that shift. And so praying for you, and it's going to take strong leadership if you're going to bring your congregation with you with the type of changes that we're talking about today.
Samuel, you may also have an extended period to do this. I know my mom is over 80, and she has no intention to step back in the church for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. So she's become an online consumer of worship, just like everybody. But even as younger people begin to venture back into the church, she's going to be a slow adopter. I think you're going to find that among many of your congregation, and that may give you more opportunity here to, one, cast that vision and get people used to that, at least for this season. So
my mom's become an online church junkie. She watches her church's service, and then another friend has a service, and then her neighbor's friend has a service. So she's become an online church junkie. She's on Facebook more than I am, Joe. I don't get it.
Yeah, yeah. So it's become a lifeline for a lot of folks using
Absolutely.
online. So we're seeing that transformation in our churches who didn't want to meet digitally are saying, it's not so bad. And
Hmm.
they've gotten their members up on Zoom and Facebook Live for worship. And so, because they don't want to get out now,
Yeah.
it's making that easier. So Carrie's asking this question: what about children youth ministry? How do you do that online? She asked another question about how do we come back safely with social
Mm.
distancing in children's areas. When I'm seeing churches that are beginning to come back, they are not offering youth and children activities during the worship hour. Uh, how do you see churches that are excelling at this doing it, Tony?
Yeah, and this honestly, this may be one of the areas where smaller churches have the advantage because they're going to be able to provide social distancing in a way that larger churches can't. But uh, that is the question that is going to prevent a lot of churches from actually coming back together for services in a physical space because if you look at all the guidelines from the experts, the way we do children's ministry in a lot of our churches, we're just not going to be able to accommodate the guidelines that will be necessary, not only to protect our kids, but probably more importantly, the older adults that are actually leading in many of those areas. And so I wish I had a magic answer for you on how to do that, but I really think for children's ministries, we're going to be following the lead of schools in many cases of how they attack that, not only for their students, but also for the teachers that are leading them. I think we're going to have to follow their lead in many instances. And that's why I think it's going to be quite some time, at least fall at the earliest, but maybe even later before we see especially larger churches coming back to accommodate that. But the good news is we are seeing churches, and actually some survey work we did a couple of weeks ago, we found that the vast majority of churches have already made the shift and are actually offering resources to equip parents online for kids ministry. And then we're seeing many churches are just like adults kind of engaging students directly through online services and small groups and things like that. In fact, my daughter has stayed connected to her small group through our church through this season. And she's saying we actually have more students engaged now than we did even before all of this. And so I do think there are ways that we can still, even while we're behind our computers, engage our students and the children in our churches. In fact, even though we don't want to admit it, they're more accustomed to doing things online and on their phones than we were. So it's not going to be abnormal for them to engage the ministry that we're offering in that same way.
So Brandon asked a question that I think will help some of the other questions that are here. Can you give a couple of examples of clear, simple paths for connection and faith formation? I think asking for examples of discipleship paths.
Yeah, so a common and probably my preference, to be honest, path that we see in churches is to think about first, how do we connect and engage with people outside the church? And then how do we encourage them to join us for a worship service? And then how do we encourage them to take a step into a serving team? And then how do we encourage them to move from a serving team to some form of biblical community? And that's going to be different for the different churches that are listening. Some may be using Sunday school class for that. Some may be using Bible studies. Some may be using small groups and homes. But it's important to help people move to that place where they're engaging and learning from God's word together in smaller groups beyond our weekend services. And so that's a common path, Joe, that we see churches embracing. You might ask, why do we encourage serving teams before Bible studies or small groups or Sunday school classes? And the reason why, particularly for men, we have seen it's easier for them to take a step into a serving team than it is into a small group or a class or a Bible study. Eventually, as they develop more relationships in the church, which happens, by the way, when you volunteer, when you serve with other people, we have found it's easier then, especially for men, just generally, but I'm sure this is across the board in churches. It's then easier then to get them into some sort of Bible engagement where they're meeting with a smaller group of people, whether that's a class or a home group.
So Brian follows up that question with, how do we track those connections? Sounds good in theory, but how do you measure it?
Yeah, so on the front end of that path, what you can be, and you could just be tracking, I mean, it's kind of a basic metric, but how many people are connecting with your content as a church? So how many people are on your email list? How many people are engaging with you on Facebook? How many people are following what you're posting in your YouTube channel? Things like that. How many people are engaging with your content? And then you can start to track, well, how many those people then become first-time visitors for one of our services on Sunday morning. And then the tracking actually gets easier, because then we can look at how many people are moving to a serving team, how many people are attending a class, how many people are moving into a small group situation. The tracking actually gets easier. But for churches, and I know this is hard to hear, the front end of that is really the most important, because it's a reflection of our mission into our communities. And honestly, that's where I think churches have the biggest challenge. Once we connect them to our church, what we've done in the past tends to work. I mean, with some nuance, I think we can help you define a discipleship path that helps people take their next steps. But it's the front end of that journey where I think churches are more challenged. And honestly, because of that, that's where your tracking needs to become more robust and focused, and you need to be monitoring that more closely.
So Jeanette asked, what are some examples of different online strategies that you like? You mentioned one, creating the, sort of the coffee hour and the lobbies on either side. What are some other strategies?
Yeah, some of it just has to do with the services themselves. I mean, as we're looking at churches, rather than just replicating the service that these churches would have on a typical Sunday morning before the coronavirus, we're seeing pastors, teachers in their living rooms with a camera, or in a space somewhere in the community talking directly to the camera, rather than trying to mimic the teaching that happened before, where we were pretending at least, or talking to a live audience in a bigger sanctuary. And there's something about that type of connection, that type of Bible teaching, that especially in the season that we're in, I think better connects the teacher with the person that you're teaching. So that's one example. We're hearing from all kinds of churches that are leveraging tools like Zoom to move from Sunday school classes and home Bible studies or small groups to actually making those digitally available to their congregation. One church I was meeting with a couple weeks ago, the gentleman was over their entire Sunday school strategy, and he said, again, just kind of like I alluded to, that they're actually seeing more engagement in their Sunday school classes now that everybody's online than they had before this pandemic even occurred. A church I was meeting with just yesterday said, we weren't doing anything with Zoom and online small groups before this, but now we're seeing it's actually a great solution, especially for young families, because it takes away the big question, which was, what do we do with our kids so that we can participate in small groups? And they said, well, we're probably going to stick with using Zoom for our small groups going forward. We've seen churches, even before all of this, be thinking about their classes, kind of the next steps they want to, Bible classes and Bible teaching, rather than just having them in the classroom in the church, thinking about how they translate that type of content so that it's available online and on demand. So those are a handful of examples, Joe, but I think what I want people to hear is don't jump too quickly to the online strategy. It's more important actually that you go back and have the harder conversation about where has God placed our church? What does our mission field look like? Who are we trying to reach? And then the discipleship strategy itself. What are those next steps we want to encourage people to take? Then you figure out how to use your online strategy to support that, rather than moving too quickly just to figuring out the different methods that we can use to engage people online.
So, Michael asked this question, how do we move our congregations to these new processes and procedures when the majority just want to go back to the way things were? Not 3 months ago, but 40 years ago. I bet you've never heard from a Back to Egypt committee in your work.
Yes. Well, it's just, again, this is, I've shared this with other church leaders in the past. Being a pastor, being a church leader sounds really glamorous until you actually have to lead. And this is the reality. Going all the way back to the days of Moses and Joshua, leaders have to lead people to places they may not necessarily want to go. And it's the reality of the world we experienced in the decades past, but it's certainly the reality of where we live today. And I've shared, I mean, the crazy thing, and I think it's one of the ways that we confirm that we actually have the spiritual gift of leadership is we see things and we see the future before normal people see them. And that doesn't make normal people bad people. It doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. It just means you're a leader and you see the future of where the church needs to go and how the church needs to get there before other people in our churches and our congregations see it. But that also means that as the leader, again, you have to cast the vision for the going to the new promised land. And you have to explain why we can't go back to Egypt and why we have to go through the desert and cross the river in order to get to the new promised land. That's what leaders do. And it's not going to be easy. Some people are going to want to go back. They're going to start grumbling. They're going to start complaining. But leaders lead the church, in our case, to a new place. And it's a place where the church can have a greater impact, where we can see more life change, where we can see more disciples of Jesus being made. And I know your heart, you want that for your church as well.